dialogue. India's population by mid-year is projected to surpass China in taking the title of the world's most populous nation, according to a recent report from the United Nations. What does this mean for the country and the world? And while India's population has been rising, China's has been declining, sparking discussions over the country's demographic transition and what it could mean for the economy. To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Professor Tim Dyson, Emeritus Professor of Population Studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science, Naijun, Associate Professor of the School of Public Policy and Management at the University of Chinese Academy of Sciences, Wang Huiyao, President at the Center for China and Globalization, and Professor Madhav Nalapat, Vice Chairman at Manipal Advanced Research Group. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. Professor Nalapat, I will start with you. So now everybody is expecting, the population of the India is to surpass that of China. India will become the most populous nation in the world. So I wonder, what's the public response to the news in India?
Well, the fact is that from the 1980s, India and China have had diametrically opposite views on population control. China has had introduced a very strict one-child policy, and in India, in 1975, there was an effort to try and limit the population through a governmental edict, but that created such a political backlash that it's now been tried since then. So, but now, fortunately, as a consequence of education and as a consequence of the rise of the lower middle class and the middle class, population in India is actually stabilizing. But there are parts of India that are still economically and educationally relatively backward. And it is in these locations that population is rising very fast. Overall, India is a very young country, as CGTN itself has said. I mean, 2/3 of our population is of working age, and a significant proportion of the population is below the age of 25. You can see that wherever you go in India, you'll find young people everywhere, and young people are optimists, especially today in an age of technology. We are possibly the largest smartphone market in the world, and our young people are very interested in technology. They have a tremendous amount of confidence, and that's why you have so many startups. So overall, I'd like to say, the young believe in themselves. We believe in our young. So for us, this was something expected, and it's not something to be dreaded.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Tim Dyson, so you have studied the population issue in India and in China for a long time. What's your takeaway? I mean, this is something expected to happen, right?
Oh, yes, it's very much expected to happen. And as I think, as Professor Nalapat mentioned, the origins of the situation which we now confront, the differences between the two countries, essentially go back to the 1970s. During the 1970s, China reduced its fertility, its birth rate, essentially, from a high to a low level, extremely rapidly. India, and as a result, there were certain fundamental changes. The population the growth rate of the population became less. The age structure of the population changed so that you had a higher proportion of China's population in the working ages. This is the so-called demographic dividend. And that continued for a considerable period of time. India, on the other hand, has basically had a slow rate of fertility decline. It did, again, as Professor Nalapat has mentioned, try briefly during the emergency period in the mid-1970s to reduce its birth rate, but it was a very short period of time. Mrs. Gandhi, the then Prime Minister, decided to call an election. So overall, India has had a much slower birth rate decline, and its rate of population growth has been much greater than that of China. India's growth rate coming down, China's growth rate coming down really quite rapidly, India's population growth rate coming down more slowly. So demographers have known for a considerable period of time that India's population would become larger than that of China. It may already have done so. Maybe last year, all the figures are a little bit rough, but yes, we've known that this was going to happen for a considerable period of time.
Well, that's true. Huiyao, because we have this similar situation, or had a similar situation with India, both countries once turned to measures to limit the growth of a population, obviously out of concern of so-called population explosion, or population is seen as a burden. But now people are talking about the demographic dividend. You have a strong pool of labor force, and then that can help facilitate the economic growth. So it's a kind of a mixed feeling sometimes. Like you don't know how to, whether we should celebrate or whether we should be concerned sometimes with the population rise or population, coming down. What's your reaction?
Yeah, thank you. No, I think it's probably about right. I mean, India has long overdue. I mean, now surpassed China as the largest, most populous country in the world, which is great. I mean, India is also young and dynamic. But I think in China is also great now, because I think we're from high, just like Chinese government reports, from high growth to high quality now. So we have, in the previous report this year, we have 214 million college graduates among this 1.4 billion population, which means that China probably is the largest, most educated in terms of percentage-wise, absolute number, not percentage, but absolute number is the largest in the world now. And also, I think Chinese population age is still, I mean, India is 28, 29, China is 39. But again, we need to turn the population dividend to talent dividend. So I think, with every year, there's about 11.5 million graduates out of college, another 500,000 returnees coming back. China has about 12 million freshly educated college workforce. So I think, but also we have to take a bit more, futuristic view on that, because now with ChatGPT, with artificial intelligence, it does not necessarily mean you have a larger the population, the better you are, because all those things can be replaced by many of things can be replaced by the technology. And also, I think China's decline of the population was a little bit over alarmed about. For example, last year there was about 400,000 decline in terms of negative rather than positive number. But last 2 years, a lot of people was COVID, lockdown. There's no interest to have births. There's a lot of vaccine has been vaccinated many times. Many people delay their birth giving. So I don't think this accelerated already. Mm-hmm. So it's going to still have another 5-10 years probably down the road, gradually decline. But then on the other hand, China has gradually significantly increased its population quality, and talent dividend is going to trickle down. So I'm not that pessimistic. I think China still has a very good population, high, quality population, talent dividend to reap off for the number of years to come.
Yeah, it seems for both countries, it's really about how you manage the population, whether it's getting smaller or growing larger. So Naijun, we in China, we still remember, it used to be, a lot of people, when talk about the challenges facing the society, the country, people often complain the large size of population. But then, when China opened the door and reform and opening up policy initiated in the late 1970s, so gradually the large population has actually become the dividend. People talk about the demographic dividend facilitating the development of the nation. So how has China done basically to make good use of that large size of population, let's say, for developing socially and economically?
Well, I think from economically point of view, we had used or take advantage of the so-called population dividend. As we all know that back in 1980s, we take advantage of this kind of labor resources to develop our economy. which in my opinion is the so-called labor dividend theory. And especially after 2001, when we joined the WHO, China has also taken advantage of this population dividend. We became the world factory, and made in China has the products of made in China are everywhere to be seen in the world. So I think at least back to 20 years ago, we are, in my opinion, a very successful economy in taking advantage of this labor dividend. However, we only witnessed the decline of our whole population in last year, but we must remember that we have been witnessing the labor age population decline in 2012, that is 10 years ago. That is to say, our labor age population has been declining for more than 10 years. So I think at least from 10 years ago, we have decided that we cannot hold the situations back in 20 years for too long, because we have to witness the competition, not only from India, but also from Vietnam, because not only our number of population is declining, but also our labor cost is increasing. Our wage level is, in my opinion, much larger than India and Vietnam. So this has a tremendous change and challenge to our international trade, to our international investment, and to our logistic or the production chains. So I think, yes, there will be a lot of challenges and changes to our economy.
Professor Nalapat, optimists would say the time for India has arrived, as you pointed out. Some people are probably a little bit more pessimistic and focusing on the problems and challenges. For example, there's a report carried by CNN warning that India is sitting on a time bomb and there will be social unrest if it cannot create enough employment in a relatively short period of time. I wonder, what the government is doing basically to create jobs, probably for the young people, or is the statement the accurate description of the situation?
Well, the fact is that India is a large country, and there are different conditions at work in different parts of India. But I'd like to say that there are certain things there are certain qualities that a human being has got that a robot does not have. For example, human empathy. Let's say that in Japan, for example, you have a very aging population. You are going to need a lot of carers. And, a machine caring for you is very different from a human being, with deep sympathy and possibly a feeling of sentiment binding you to the individual you're caring for. So the reality is that in India, what we are trying to do, we are trying to harness technology and human power. Education, for example, as a teacher, and I'm sure the other teachers here will agree with me, there is an advantage to teaching in a classroom or to having direct interaction with your students that you don't get online, for example. So we are now trying to innovate in this kind of a hybrid model in which technology is fused with human power, so that at the end of the show, it's not a question of one replacing the other, but technology empowering human power. And if you empower human power, you create wealth. Well, there will be avenues for that wealth, and there will be individuals who hopefully will take advantage of those avenues. I'd like to say that in India, we're not really looking only at the government for all our solutions. We are looking, apart from a huge number of self-governing, with states, cities, villages, the reality is that we are trying to have, as Prime Minister Modi said before he became Prime Minister, minimum government and maximum governance. So the idea is to give the citizen the freedom he or she should have in order to create a better future for herself or himself.
Professor Tim Dyson, obviously, with a large population, in particular, like in the India situation, the young population, 2/3 of the overall population, that's very promising. But of course, some people say that's a challenge, if you don't have enough job opportunities. So what does it take, basically? What are the factors leading to or transitioning the larger population into, say, demographic dividend, that will help develop the country?
Well, I think really Professor Wang essentially mentioned the key aspect of this, and others have alluded to it too, and that is that essentially China reduced its birth rate rapidly, but then it had smaller numbers of children to educate. And so it was able essentially to educate them more and more and more to a higher and higher level, essentially to improve the level of human capital. That is a fundamental strength, which I think China has going forwards. So far as India is concerned, well, and the future, of course, one has to say this, we all tend to compare India and China, but they are very different countries. India is much more diverse, and many people would say it was a more open society. The demographic increase that has occurred in India has had this effect of splitting the country up into more and more units. So as the population has grown, so more states have been created for various reasons, more administrative districts have been created. And so there has, to some extent, been a diffusion of power down to the grassroots level, as Professor Nalapat essentially intimated. Now, don't get me wrong, there's going to be another 200 million people or so, roughly, added to India's population in the next 20 to 30 years. And as you've implied, that poses challenges for providing sufficient employment, and it also provides challenges for basic resources such as water resources, for example, which are under greater stress than they otherwise would have been. So both countries, India and China, they face different futures, and the futures have to be confronted. It doesn't matter which country you're in, the demography has to be grappled with. It presents problems, yes, challenges, but it does also sometimes prevent opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Well, Huiyao, just as Professor Dyson mentioned, both societies, both countries, face both opportunities and also challenges. For example, in China's situation, you earlier mentioned about the declining population, people say shrinking population. There's a concern with probably rising labor costs, for example. And then people are concerned with the shifting of the global supply chain. For example, some of the manufacturers are, could be thinking of, migrating to India, to Malaysia, to Bangladesh, to Vietnam. And how will China do, basically, to continue to be competitive? I mean, to create a better or competitive business environment to draw and to win more investment from the private sector as well as overseas?
China produced the largest middle class in the world. And China produced the largest education system, largest social security system, and largest, Medicare system, all about 1 billion people, and compulsory education, of course, already get 1 to 9 already mandatory all throughout the country. So what I think now, China actually, what has to get into that, because China, as we said about, expensive labor cost, deteriorated geopolitical environment, low manufacturing jobs are going to other countries now. So what China can do? Well, I think the China has actually showed quite well that digital economy is really flourishing. You have 1.2 billion smartphone users, the largest in the world. And then you have 6 million 5G stations, 4G stations. Anywhere you go is well connected. And on top of that, China produced the best infrastructure in the world. China has 2/3 of global speedway in China. And out of the 10 largest container ports, 7 of them are in China. So is the upstream, downstream, and such a highly effective working force. I think that is still a synergy to attract foreign investment and business to in China, but also upgrade that. So I think it's probably, even for multinational, and also there's no strikes in China. I mean, we've been plagued by strikes we recently see in Western countries, but China does not have. So China was saying, China is trying to produce a Chinese style of modernization, which is fine. So that encourages every country to have their style of modernization, Indian style of modernization, African style of modernization, Latin American style. So we don't have to follow one suit of American style of modernization. So that is great. I think let's innovate. Let's do that so that we can If China can work out, getting through this middle income trap, that's why President Brazil was in China, highly praised China development. So I think we still have a lot of challenges, but China can really see how the technology and combined e-commerce, rural revitalization. One of the biggest dividend China needs to tap into is the household land of the farmers should be transactionable, like the housing in the city. That's another big stimulus for Chinese economy that we have to tap into.
Mm-hmm. Well, Naijun, if you look at the Chinese economy, the first quarter, it's a better than expected result, more than 4.5%. So people are talking about at the same time there are another side to the story. Like if you look at the employment issue, 16 to 24-year-olds, their unemployment population is proportion is almost like 20%. That's much higher than the governments would like to see. So what can we do? On one hand, you have people are concerned with the shrinking population. On the other hand, you have young people. There's not enough jobs for them.
Well, I think, yes, if you look at the number, the data of the first quarter economy in China, we can see the consumption has to take its advantage. As far as we can see that consumption has taken about more than 60%. That is nearly 2/3 of the new growth of our economy. And we also are taking the transition from the investment centered, from the international trade centered to consumption centered economy. So I think in the future, as we have talked about, we must take advantage of this transition. We must make our tertiary sector to develop, to flourish. We must make sure that people will consume, and we also will take the transition from labor-intensive production to technical-intensive production. So during these transitions, we have a lot of things to do. We, as our professors have mentioned, that technological investment we must take in, and also I think we must develop our healthcare services and healthcare management services, especially like medicines, like new genes, etc., etc. So I think in the future, we must take advantage of transition, and we also have to transit our economy from the old pattern to the new pattern. And I think also at the same time, we must make sure that our education, healthcare, housing, etc., social aspect must also develop with it, because this is also the LSE professor Amartyasen's point of view of enabling state and capacity building pattern. We must make sure that our population, although it's aging, although our labor population number is declining, but we must make sure that our technology and education can take the advantage.
Mm-hmm. Professor Nalapat, you mentioned education earlier. Obviously, it's very important, in particular to young people, to provide with them, education and also training, so they become this, potentially very, useful labor force to stimulate economic growth. But at the same time, people are also looking at other factors, for example, business environment, so you can attract a lot of investment to create jobs for the young people. So tell us more about India overall development. What are the when we talk about the growth of a nation, you say either you are relying on trade, export driven, investment driven, or creation of a startup, young people, jobs like India. What are the priorities of the government right now?
Well, actually, I'd like to point out that in India, when you compare to China, the infrastructure is definitely not of the same standard. But now, because of technology, the advantage is that, through remote means, you can bring education to villages in India, across many villages in India. Now, in the past, the fact was it was difficult to get teachers for these villages. It was difficult to get healthcare workers for these villages. And now you have individuals who are teachers in a more basic way, healthcare workers who are into basic health. At the same time, you have telemedicine, and you have education through the use of technology. And as a consequence, the quality is rising for hundreds of millions of young minds. So this is where, Digital India, for the last 10 years, a tremendous amount of emphasis has been placed on Digital India. In fact, we went ahead with the demonetization in 2016, in which 86% of the cash currency was declared illegal at a matter of 4 hours' notice. The idea was to ensure that the digital use of money would expand, and it was quite a shock, but it has expanded. So frankly, I'd like to say that we are placing our bets on technology. And one thing that gives us confidence, you go to Europe, you go to the United Kingdom, you go to the United States, you go to other parts of the world, and you see young Indian minds at work in technical laboratories, in educational institutions, and they're doing excellent work. And for us, I'd like to say, we're not talking about them coming back. We are saying that we have a reservoir of young people. And when you have declining populations in so many important countries in the world, well, someday you're going to need human power also. Because I think, frankly, all this talk about human power being less important than machine power or a non-human kind of power, I think that's highly exaggerated. Ultimately, it's human beings that have made the world what it is. And in that, I would like to say, for at least the next 4 or 5 decades, I think India has an advantage.
Mm-hmm. Professor Tim Dyson, of course, when we talk about India surpassing China in terms of population, and then you do see there's some discussion like in some media, or China is overtaken by India. They say India is going to have the largest market, the largest economy. So what makes China, or what should China do probably? What's the potential continue to be unleashed to develop the economy?
So far as China is concerned, I think there will probably be a decline in the rate of per capita income growth looking into the future. And the reason simply being that this incredibly rapid rate of economic development in China has occurred at roughly the time that your age structure changed, so that you had a higher and higher proportion of the population in the main working ages. So I do expect in China, as in any country, I do expect there to be a move away from the incredibly rapid rates of economic growth that have occurred in the past. Now, in this context, where are we going? Where are we going? I'll tell you roughly where we're all going. All populations are going to age. What should China do? Well, China's doing 110 things anyhow. But I do think that it's important to try and moderate the rate of fertility decline, and therefore moderate the pace at which populations get smaller. And indeed, I understand the Chinese government is taking steps in that direction to try and boost fertility a little, so that you don't have a very rapid population decline, which really would represent a major problem for any society. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think it is important to look at other countries to see how they deal with this issue of population aging and population decline. Countries in Europe have quite a bit to learn from you in East Asia, and also there are some important lessons in parts of Europe as to how to raise the birth rate a little.
Thanks to all for your participation. And with that, we come to the end for today's show. Again, thank you for joining us. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qingduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.